There is the lingering echo of a standing ovation in Chicago. And then there is the devastating stillness of a hotel room where Robin Harris, the master of old school cool, was found dead at 36. How could the man who turned everyday frustrations into legendary comedy, giving life to babies' kids, simply close his eyes and leave a pregnant wife behind? It wasn't just the death of a comedian, it was a brutal theft of time, taking him away just months before he could look into the eyes of the son who would carry his name. He was undeniably the breakout star, stealing scenes in House Party and standing on the very brink of becoming a household legend. After decades of grinding in the shadows to reach this peak, fate cruelly cut the cord the exact moment he finally grasped success. It is the ultimate heartbreak to win the race, only to collapse at the finish line, leaving the world with nothing but what ifs. This is the reality of a king crowned too late, and here is where his story truly begins. He was not a product of Hollywood nepotism or art school training. He was forged in the fires of the American Midwest. It was August 30th, 1953. The place was Chicago, Illinois. Specifically, the Harris family resided at 4640 South Drexel Avenue. 1953 was a pivotal year in American history. The Korean War had just ended in an armistice a month prior. Dwight D. Eisenhower was in the White House, and Chicago was the thumping industrial heart of the nation. It was the city of big shoulders, as the poet Carl Sandburg wrote, a place of stockyards, steel mills, and factories that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For a black family in Chicago in the 1950s, life was defined by a specific kind of grit. The Harris family was the definition of the American working class. His father, Earl Harris, was a welder for the Ford Motor Company. We must pause to appreciate what that meant. Earl was a man who worked with fire and steel. He spent his days in deafening noise, surrounded by sparks and heat, building the automobiles that defined the era. It was dangerous, exhausting, physical labor. It required a steadiness of hand and a toughness of spirit. His mother, Mattie, was a factory seamstress. While Earl worked with hard metal, Mattie worked with fabric, her hands moving with precision and speed to meet quotas in the garment district. This was not a family of performers. There were no actors in the lineage, no vaudevillians. This was a family of survivors. They were essential cogs in the great engine of industry that powered the post-war economic boom. The atmosphere of the Harris household was one of discipline and survival. In the Chicago of the 50s, you didn't complain about your feelings. You paid your rent. You put food on the table. This stoicism, this no-nonsense approach to existence, seeped into Robin's DNA from infancy. The humor of the South Side wasn't whimsical. It was sharp. It was a defense mechanism against the cold wind off Lake Michigan and the harsh realities of segregation and economic struggle. However, the winds of change were blowing across Black America. The Great Migration, the massive movement of African Americans from the rural South and the industrial Midwest to the West Coast, was in full swing. Families were chasing the promise of better jobs, better weather, and a reprieve from the stifling congestion of the older cities. In 1961, when Robin was just 8 years old, the Harris family made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. They packed up their belongings, left the brick and mortar of Chicago, and moved west to Los Angeles, California. This geographical shift is the first crucial key to unlocking Robin Harris's persona. He was a hybrid. He possessed a Chicago soul, tough, direct, skeptical, grounded, but he was planted in the sunshine and artifice of Southern California. Imagine the culture shock for an 8-year-old boy. He went from the gray skies and heavy coats of Chicago to the palm trees, an endless summer of L.A. But do not mistake this for a move to luxury. The Los Angeles of the 1960s that the Harris family entered was a place of simmering tension and distinct boundaries. They settled in the working-class neighborhoods where the struggle continued just under a hotter sun. This duality created the friction that makes for great comedy. He had the laid-back rhythm of the West Coast, but the biting, cold-wind wit of the Midwest. He could navigate the relaxed social circles of L.A., but he viewed them with the cynical eyes of a Chicagoan who knows that winter is always coming. As Robin grew into his teenage years, he attended Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles. And here we encounter the greatest contradiction of his life, a fact that shocks almost everyone who only knows him from his later years. When you visualize the Robin Harris of the late 1980s, you see a man who moved with a deliberate slowness. He was heavy-set, often sweating under the stage lights, projecting an old man energy that suggested he would rather be sitting in a recliner than standing at a microphone. He used his physical bulk as part of his comedy, presenting himself as a man who had no time for cardio or rushing. But in high school, Robin Harris was a star athlete. He wasn't just a participant, he was a competitor. He ran track and field. Specifically, he was a middle distance runner. He had speed, he had endurance, he had the lung capacity of a champion. Photographs from this era show a lean, muscular young man exploding off the starting blocks, his face contorted in the focus of the race. It is fascinating to analyze this through the lens of psychology. Track and field is a lonely sport. It is you against the clock. It requires internal discipline and the ability to push through pain, traits he likely inherited from his welder father. However, it was in the locker rooms and on the bus rides to track meets that the comedian began to emerge. In the black community, particularly among young men, there is a verbal tradition known as the dozens. It is a game of rapid-fire insults, a verbal duel where participants attack each other's appearance, intelligence, poverty, or family members. To the outsider, it looks like cruelty, but culturally, it serves a vital function. It is a training ground. It teaches you to have thick skin. It teaches you to think on your feet. It teaches you to maintain your composure while being attacked. If you get angry, you lose. If you laugh, you survive. Robin was a master of the dozens. His teammates would later recall that before a big track meet, when the tension was high and stomachs were churning with nerves, Robin would go to work. He would start roasting his teammates. He'd talk about their raggedy shoes. He'd talk about their uneven haircuts. He'd talk about their mothers. He wasn't doing it to be mean. He was doing it to lead. He would have the whole team doubled over laughing, tears streaming down their faces. The fear of the upcoming race would dissolve in the laughter. He realized early on that humor wasn't just about entertainment. It was a form of control. It was a way to manage fear in the room. He could manipulate the energy of a group of people simply by opening his mouth. This was the first time he tasted the power he would later wield on stage. His athletic prowess was significant enough to earn him a ticket out. He received a track scholarship to Ottawa University in Kansas. For a young black man from Los Angeles moving to rural Kansas in the early 1970s was another profound culture shock. It was a period of isolation. While he continued to run, his heart began to drift. The discipline of the track began to lose its appeal against the magnetic pull of the microphone. He was the funniest man on campus, the guy who could hold court in the dormitories late into the night. He eventually left Kansas and returned to Los Angeles. But he did not return as a star. He returned to the grind. This is the part of the biography that is most essential to his relatability. Robin Harris did not shoot straight to stardom at age 20. He did not get a sitcom deal right out of college. He lived the life. He entered the workforce, and we aren't talking about showbiz jobs. He worked for Hughes Aircraft, likely utilizing the technical mindset his father possessed. He worked at a rental car agency, dealing with irate customers and damaged vehicles. He worked at Security Pacific Bank. Stop and imagine that image for a moment. Imagine walking into a bank in Los Angeles in 1978 to apply for a loan. The man sitting across the desk wearing a cheap polyester suit and a tie, looking at your credit score with a mixture of pity and judgment, is Robin Harris. These years were not wasted time. They were research. When he later went on stage and complained about bills, about predatory credit collectors, about broken down cars and difficult bosses, he wasn't imagining it. He wasn't writing material. He was reporting from the front lines of the working class. He was building the reservoir of frustration that would eventually erupt into comedy gold. He understood the indignity of the 9-to-5 grind because he was living it. He was the blue-collar comedian long before that term became a marketing franchise for cable TV. Walking away from a steady paycheck was a gamble, and the transition from the secure routines of the working class to the volatile world of stand-up was anything but smooth. The confidence he had built in the locker rooms and the bank lobbies was about to be tested against the harsh glare of the spotlight. As he stepped out of the office and into the night, Robin Harris wasn't just changing careers, he was entering a battlefield where his unique voice would have to fight to be heard. The Chicago grit was there, but the Polish was missing, and finding his footing would require him to navigate a comedy landscape that didn't initially know what to do with him. By 1980, Robin Harris had made his decision. He was trading the security of the bank teller's cage for the terrifying uncertainty of the stage. He made his debut at the Comedy Store in West Hollywood. To understand this moment, you must visualize the landscape of American comedy in 1980. The Comedy Store, run by the legendary Mitzi Shore, was the Mecca. It was the Vatican of jokes. This was the era where Richard Pryor had already ascended to godhood, where Robin Williams was a chaotic whirlwind of energy, and where Jay Leno and David Letterman were the young princes in waiting. The Comedy Store was a shark tank. It was segregated not by law but by style and expectation. There was the main room, where the polished headliners performed for tourists and Hollywood executives. And there was the belly room upstairs, often reserved for experimental acts and female comedians. Robin Harris walked into this environment with his Chicago grit, but candidly, he did not conquer it immediately. In fact, his early years were a struggle. The prevailing style of the early 80s was high energy. Cocaine was fueling the industry, both backstage and on stage. Audiences were accustomed to manic pacing, physical gyrations, and rapid-fire delivery. Robin Harris was none of those things. He was slow. He was deliberate. He didn't run around the stage. He occupied it. In a room full of comedians trying to be the wildest guy in the room, Robin was trying to be the most sensible. At the Comedy Store, performing largely for white audiences or mixed tourist crowds, his specific brand of culturally rooted blue-collar black humor didn't always translate instantly. He was good. He was always funny. But he was a square peg in a round hole. He was still searching for his frequency. He spent the first half of the 1980s grinding. He was a comics comic, respected by his peers who saw the gears turning, but not yet a commercial breakout. He was still driving that rental car mentality, working the late shifts, trying to figure out how to translate the locker room dominance he had in high school to a room full of strangers on the Sunset Strip. The transformation, the metamorphosis from a struggling comic to a legend, happened around 1985. It happened when Robin found his true home. He moved his focus from West Hollywood to the Crenshaw district, specifically to a venue known as the Comedy Act Theater. We cannot overstate the importance of this building. If the Comedy Store was the polished showroom, the Comedy Act Theater was the underground boxing gym. Owned by Michael Williams, this was the heartbeat of black comedy in Los Angeles. It was the West Coast equivalent of the Apollo Theater in Harlem. The audience here wasn't tourists from Ohio. It was the people of South Central LA. It was a discerning, brutal, honest, and raucous crowd. If you weren't funny here, they wouldn't just not laugh. They would boo you out of the building. They would roast you harder than you could roast them. Robin Harris didn't just perform here. He became the MC. He became the host. This distinction is vital. In the hierarchy of a comedy show, the headliner gets the glory, but the host does the work. The host has to go out first, warm up a cold room, deal with the announcements, manage the hecklers, bringing up the other acts, and keep the energy alive during the lulls. It is the hardest job in show business. Robin Harris turned this thankless job into a position of absolute monarchy. Because he was the host, he was on stage for hours. He wasn't limited to a tight 15-minute set. He had the freedom to roam. And in this environment, the old school persona fully crystallized. He stopped trying to compete with the high-energy kids. Instead, he leaned all the way into his natural gravity. Let us dissect the Robin Harris persona that emerged during these late nights on Crenshaw Boulevard. He developed a look that was instantly recognizable. He would stand center stage, often holding the microphone in one hand and a lit cigarette or a drink in the other. His posture was that of a man who had just finished a double shift at the factory. He had heavy-lidded eyes, bedroom eyes, some called them, but they were really the eyes of judgment. He looked at the audience like a disappointed father waiting for you to explain why you crashed the car. He radiated authority. In a world of boys, he was a grown man. While other comedians were desperate for the audience to like them, Robin Harris projected an attitude that suggested he didn't care if you laughed or not. He was going to say what he had to say. Paradoxically, this made the audience love him even more. They were desperate for his approval. He utilized silence better than anyone since Jack Benny. He would deliver a line and then he would just stare. He would let the line hang in the smoky air. He would take a drag of his cigarette. He would wait. He forced the audience to come to him. He slowed the heart rate of the room down to his tempo. This was the birth of the old school cool. He represented a generation that was fading away. The generation of guys who wore hats, opened doors, worked hard jobs, and didn't tolerate foolishness. He was the bridge between the jazz era and the hip-hop era. It was during his tenure as the MC at the Comedy Act Theater that he revolutionized the art of crowd work. Usually, comedians fear the front row. The front row is dangerous. You can see their faces. They can see yours. If they aren't laughing, it kills your soul. Robin Harris weaponized the front row. He didn't just talk to them, he dismantled them. People started coming to the Comedy Act Theater specifically to sit in the front row just for the honor of being verbally abused by Robin Harris. It became a badge of honor. He had an uncanny ability to scan a person in 3 seconds and find their deepest insecurity or their most ridiculous feature. "Where you get that jacket?" he would ask, leaning in. "The Goodwill hostage negotiation sale?" "Look at your head. Your head looks like a polished milk dud." He would go after your date. He would go after your shoes. He would go after your laugh, but, and this is the key to his genius, it never felt hateful. It felt communal. It was the dozens from the high school locker room, elevated to theater. By roasting the individual, he united the room. When he made fun of the guy in the ugly shirt, the other 200 people in the room laughed together. It created a bond. He was the governor of the room. If a heckler tried to interrupt him, Robin didn't panic. He would slowly turn his head, fix the heckler with that withering stare, and dismantle him with a single sentence so devastating that the heckler would often leave the club in shame. Young comedians would stand in the back of the room, watching him in awe. Martin Lawrence, D.L. Hewley, Bernie Mac, they were all watching. Chris Rock, who was just a kid coming up, later said that Robin Harris turned the phrase F you into a piece of classical music. He could say it with a smile, with a grimace, with a shrug, and it meant 10 different things. He taught a generation of comics that you didn't need props, you just needed presence. However, biography requires us to look behind the curtain. The old school persona was so impenetrable that people assumed Robin Harris was made of stone. They assumed he was this tough, unshakable Chicago welder in a suit. But his close friends and his wife Exetta knew the truth. Robin Harris was a man of profound sensitivity and deep insecurity. There is a tragic archetype of the sad clown, and Robin fitted uncomfortably well. Despite the fact that he was killing it every night, despite the fact that he was the king of Los Angeles comedy, he was plagued by doubt. Peers recall nights where Robin would have the audience rolling in the aisles, standing ovations, people gasping for breath, and then he would go backstage, sit in the dressing room, and put his head in his hands. He would ask his friends, "Was I funny? Did they really like me? I felt like I lost them in the middle." He carried the heavy burden of the perfectionist. He was terrified of becoming stale. He was terrified of the silence. The bravado he showed on stage was in many ways a suit of armor he put on to protect the soft, vulnerable heart underneath. He felt the pressure to provide, not just for himself, but for his family, for his mother Maddie, and for the community that looked up to him. He was also battling physical demons. By the late 80s, his weight had increased significantly. The lifestyle of the comedian, late nights, fried food, alcohol, cigarettes, no sleep, was taking a toll on his body. He suffered from sleep apnea, a condition that was not well diagnosed or treated at the time. He was constantly exhausted. The sleepy eyes that became his trademark weren't just an act, they were a symptom. He was a man running on fumes, fueled only by the adrenaline of the laugh. It was out of this mixture of exhaustion, frustration, and brilliant observation that his masterpiece was born. Every comedian needs a signature bit. Richard Pryor had the heart attack. Eddie Murphy had the ice cream man. Robin Harris had BB's kids. The story is rooted in truth. Robin was dating a woman named Jamaica. Jamaica was lovely, but she came with baggage. Specifically, she had a friend who had severe issues with childcare. Whenever Robin wanted to take Jamaica out for a date, trying to be the romantic suitor, he somehow ended up babysitting Bebe's children. One night at the Comedy Act Theater, Robin went on stage and just started venting. He wasn't telling jokes, he was complaining. He told the audience about taking these badass kids to an amusement park. He described the children not as innocent cherubs, but as domestic terrorists. They didn't listen. They hit the mascots. They stole. They bullied him. "These ain't my kids," he would roar. "These are Baby's kids." The audience lost their minds. Why? Because everyone knew those kids. Everyone had a cousin or a neighbor or a nephew who was uncontrollable. Robin broke the taboo of talking about bad children. He improvised the routine night after night, adding details. He talked about the boy with the runny nose. He talked about the girl who threatened to beat him up. And then he hit upon the punchline that would become a global catchphrase. In the routine, he confronts the kids, asking them why they are so bad. And the kids reply in a demonic unison, "We Bebe's kids, we don't die, we multiply." It was funny, yes. But look closer at the sociology of the joke. It was a statement of resilience from the underclass. It was a declaration of survival. No matter how hard society makes it for us, no matter the poverty or the struggle, we are still here. We are still multiplying. The audience roared because they recognized the truth in the exaggeration. They saw their own resilience reflected in the defiance of these terrible children. With the Comedy Act Theater under his command and the streets of Los Angeles buzzing with his name, the confines of the club circuit could no longer contain him. The old school authority he had perfected in the dark, smoky rooms of South Central was now undeniable, catching the attention of the biggest movers and shakers in the entertainment industry. As the 1980s drew to a close, Robin Harris was poised to take his specific brand of blue-collar brilliance from the local stage to the global screen. The underground legend was about to step into the mainstream sun, joining the very icons he had once admired from afar. If 1988 was the year Robin Harris knocked on the door, 1989 was the year he kicked it down. To understand his trajectory, we must look at the company he began to keep. Eddie Murphy was the biggest star on the planet. Richard Pryor was the godfather of comedy. Red Fox was the legend of television. When Eddie Murphy decided to direct and star in Harlem Nights, a period piece set in the 1930s, he assembled a cast that was essentially the Mount Rushmore of black comedy, and he called Robin Harris. Robin was cast as Romeo, the stuttering doorman. On paper, it was a minor role. In the hands of a lesser performer, Romeo would have been a forgettable piece of background furniture. But Robin Harris did not do background. There is a specific scene in the film that film students and comedians still study today. It involves Robin Harris sharing the screen with the Titans. He wasn't intimidated. He didn't shrink. He brought that same comedy act theater energy, that sluggish, heavy-lidded, unimpressed authority to the 1930s setting. He held his own against Murphy and Pryor not by being louder than them, but by being denser than them. He was an immovable object of comedy. The industry took notice. It is one thing to be funny in a club in South Central. It is another thing entirely to steal a scene from Eddie Murphy in a Paramount Pictures blockbuster. Harlem Nights proved that Robin's humor translated. It wasn't just hood humor. It was character work of the highest order. He was proving to be a character actor with the soul of a lead. But if Harlem Nights gave him credibility, House Party gave him immortality. Released in March 1990, House Party was a low-budget film that exploded into a cultural phenomenon. It starred the hip-hop duo Kid in Play and captured the vibrant, joyful energy of black youth culture at the turn of the decade. Robin Harris played Pop, the father of the main character, Kid. This role is the cornerstone of his legacy. In the script, Pop could have been a villain, the grumpy dad trying to stop the kids from having fun. But Robin infused the character with a profound, recognizable humanity. He channeled every black father who worked too hard, slept too little, and worried too much about his son dying in the streets. He was terrifying, yes. When he sat in his chair, eyes bulging, voice dropping to a subterranean growl, the audience held its breath. But beneath the terror was love. He delivered lines that have been etched into the African-American lexicon. I brought you into this world, and I'll take you out. I don't give a damn if Marvin Gaye is gonna be there, he improvised wildly. The scene where he is in bed, dreaming and talking in his sleep about roaches and giant spiders, was pure Robin Harris stream of consciousness. The critics went wild. The New York Times, Roger Ebert, Variety, they all singled him out. He was the anchor of the movie. He provided the gravity that kept the high-energy hip-hop antics grounded in reality. For his performance, he would later receive a posthumous nomination for an Independent Spirit Award for Best Supporting Male. By early March 1990, Robin Harris was everywhere. He was on Arsenio Hall. He was in the papers. He had a deal on the table to turn Bebe's Kids into a feature film. He had sitcom offers piling up on his agent's desk. The years of driving rental cars and working at the bank were ancient history. He had made it. However, while the public saw the rising star, the private reality was darker. The human body keeps a score that cannot be paid off with box office receipts. Robin was 36 years old, but physically, he was much older. His weight had ballooned to over 250 pounds. The lifestyle of the road was brutal. Comedians live on adrenaline, late-night meals at diners, alcohol and cigarettes. Robin was a chain smoker. More critically, he suffered from severe sleep apnea. In 1990, this condition was not as widely understood or treated as it is today. Sleep apnea meant that Robin essentially stopped breathing dozens, perhaps hundreds, of times a night. His body was never truly resting. He was in a state of chronic, crushing oxygen deprivation. Friends noticed that he would fall asleep mid-conversation. He would doze off in the green room seconds before going on stage, then snap awake and perform, only to collapse back into a chair afterwards. He was pushing a machine that was flashing red warning lights. But he couldn't stop. The momentum was finally there. The money was finally coming. He had a wife, Exetta, who was pregnant with their first child. He had a mother to support. He felt he had to run while the track was clear. In mid-March 1990, Robin Harris traveled back to his birthplace, Chicago. It was a victory lap. The boy from Drexel Avenue was returning as a conqueror. He was booked for a show at the Regal Theater on the South Side. Chicago crowds are notoriously tough. They are the home crowd, and they expect the best. Robin delivered. On the night of Saturday, March 17th, he performed to a sold-out house. He destroyed the room. He was sharp. He was biting. He was the governor. After the show, he was in high spirits. He greeted fans, signed autographs, and soaked in the love of his city. He checked into the Four Seasons Hotel on Delaware Place. It was a symbol of how far he had come, from the factory floors his parents worked to the plush suites of the Four Seasons. He spoke to his mother, Maddie, on the phone. They made plans for the next day. Sunday, March 18th, was supposed to be a family day. He was going to see his people. He hung up the phone, perhaps had a final cigarette, and laid down to sleep. Sunday morning broke over Chicago, cold and crisp. Maddie Harris waited for her son. He was usually punctual, or at least he would call. But the phone didn't ring. Hours passed. The old-school code of respect meant you didn't leave your mother waiting. Worry began to set in. Calls to his hotel room went unanswered. The front desk rang and rang. Nothing. Finally, driven by that terrifying maternal instinct that knows when something is wrong, Maddie went to the hotel. She, along with hotel staff, went up to the room. They found him in bed. He looked peaceful, as if he were just taking one of his famous naps. But the silence in the room was absolute. Robin Harris was dead. The official cause of death was ruled as respiratory failure brought on by a heart attack. The medical examiner essentially described a perfect storm. The obesity, the enlarged heart, the exhaustion, and the sleep apnea had conspired against him. He had likely stopped breathing in his sleep, and his tired heart, strained beyond its limit, simply gave up. He died alone in a luxury hotel room, surrounded by the invisible echoes of the applause he had earned just hours before. The news hit Hollywood like a sledgehammer. It didn't make sense. He was 36. House Party had been in theaters for exactly 9 days. The posters were still up on every bus stop in Los Angeles. The commercials were running on MTV every hour. How could the man who was taking us out be gone? The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He had spent 15 years climbing the mountain, scraping his knuckles, fighting for every inch. And the moment he reached the summit, the moment the view opened up, he collapsed. His body was flown back to Los Angeles. The funeral was held at the West Angeles Church of God in Christ. It was a who's who of black entertainment. Richard Pryor sat in the pews looking devastated. Keenan Ivory Wayans, Robert Townsend, Martin Lawrence, Spike Lee, they were all there united in a stunned silence. But the most heartbreaking sight was his wife, Exetta. She was heavily pregnant. She sat in the front row, carrying the future of a man who was now in the past. 6 months after Robin Harris was lowered into the ground at Inglewood Park Cemetery, his son was born. He was named Robin Harris Jr., a son who would inherit a name that opened doors, a son who would inherit residuals from a movie masterpiece, but a son who would never feel the stubble of his father's beard, never hear the gravel of his voice in the kitchen, never learn how to run track or tell a joke from the man who mastered both. The death of Robin Harris is often compared to the deaths of musicians like Otis Redding or Sam Cooke. It is the tragedy of the unfinished masterpiece. We only saw the warm-up act, we saw the struggle, and we saw the breakthrough, but we never got to see the rain. We never got to see Robin Harris in his 40s, his 50s. We never got to see him take on dramatic roles. We never got to see him get his own sitcom, which was inevitably coming. We were left with a handful of movies and the bootleg tapes of his comedy shows. We were left with the what ifs. But here is the miraculous thing about Robin Harris. He refused to disappear. Most comedians, when they die young, fade into trivia. Their jokes age poorly. Their references become dated. But Robin Harris had built something on a foundation of truth so solid that it withstood the passage of time. He had planted seeds in the minds of his protégés and in the culture itself. And in the years following his death, something extraordinary happened. The old school philosophy didn't die with him. In fact, his friends and collaborators decided that if Robin couldn't live to see his legacy, they would build it for him. They would take the voice that had been silenced and amplify it until the whole world heard it. The silence that followed his passing was deafening, leaving a void in the heart of Black Hollywood that seemed impossible to fill. Yet, as the shock wore off and the grief settled, it became clear that Robin Harris was too vital a force to simply vanish into history. His physical voice had been silenced, but the echoes of his genius were only just beginning to reverberate, sparking a posthumous evolution that would prove his spirit was far more durable than his body. The man was gone, but the movement he started was about to take on a life of its own, ensuring that his influence would reach a generation he would never meet. In the weeks following Robin Harris's death, the Hudlin brothers, Reginald and Warrington, were faced with a dilemma that was both artistic and moral. They had been in pre-production with Robin for a feature film based on his BB's Kids sketches. The script was being written. The momentum was there. Usually when a star dies, the project dies with them. You cannot simply replace a force of nature like Robin Harris. But the Hudlins made a decision that would inadvertently create history. They remembered the core message of Robin's comedy, resilience. They remembered the punchline, "We don't die, we multiply." They realized that if they couldn't film Robin in the flesh, they would immortalize him in ink and paint. They pivoted the project from a live-action comedy to an animated feature film. Released in 1992, BB's Kids was a revolutionary artifact. It was the first animated feature film to feature a predominantly black cast. It brought the aesthetic of hip-hop and the specific cultural nuances of South Central Los Angeles into a medium that had previously been dominated by fairy tales and singing animals. But they had a problem. Who could possibly voice Robin Harris? His voice, that gravelly baritone cigarette-stained instrument, was as unique as a fingerprint. they found a young, then unknown comedian named Faison Love. Love didn't just do an impression, he channeled the spirit. He studied the tapes, he mastered the cadence, the slow, deliberate pauses, the way Robin would drag out the word woman until it had 3 syllables. When audiences sat in the theater and heard the animated Robin speak, it was ghostly. It was as if he had returned from the beyond to tell one last joke. The film received mixed critical reviews at the time, but it became a cult classic on VHS and cable. It introduced Robin's comedy to a generation of children who were toddlers when he died. It ensured that his most famous creation would live forever in the collective memory of Black America. The true measure of an artist's legacy is found in the work of those who come after him. If you want to find Robin Harris today, you don't just look at his movies, you look at the giants of comedy who stood on his shoulders. In 2006, a documentary was released titled We Don't Die, We Multiply, The Robin Harris Story. It was a long overdue wake for the king. In it, the biggest names in the industry sat down to pay homage. Martin Lawrence, who would go on to become a global superstar with Martin and Bad Boys, spoke with a reverence usually reserved for religious figures. Robin had been his mentor at the Comedy Act Theater. He taught Lawrence that you didn't have to run around the stage to be funny. He taught him to stand his ground. You can see Robin's DNA in Martin's character Otis, that same grumpy, authoritative old man energy. But the most direct spiritual successor to Robin Harris was Bernie Mac. When you watch Bernie Mac perform, especially his early work on Def Comedy Jam, you are seeing the evolution of the style Robin invented. The fearlessness, the bulging eyes, the I ain't scared of you attitude. Bernie Mac took the baton that Robin dropped and ran with it all the way to the finish line. Bernie openly acknowledged that Robin was the master. They were both cut from the same Chicago cloth. Men who didn't ask for permission to be in the room, but demanded it. Joe Torre, D.L. Hewley, Cedric the Entertainer, they all bowed down. They acknowledged that before the Kings of Comedy tour sold out stadiums, Robin Harris was the king of the club. He was the one who cleared the brush so they could walk the path. Perhaps the most poignant part of this entire saga is the story of the boy who arrived 6 months late. In the 2006 documentary, there is a moment where Robin Jr. performs a rap dedicated to his father. It is a moment of closing the circle, the son speaking to the father he never met, promising that the name will not fade. So how do we summarize the life of Robin Hughes Harris Sr.? He taught us that laughter is a survival tool. He taught us that the frustrations of life, the bad kids, the bills, the heat, the police, can be defeated if you rob them of their power by laughing at them. Robin Harris left the building on March 18, 1990. But the show? The show is still going on. You hear it every time a comedian roasts a heckler. You hear it every time a father looks at his son with that mixture of love and exhaustion. You hear it in the laughter that rises up from the barbershops and the backyards of America. He was right. He didn't die. He multiplied.